We are back. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Joining us now, great friend of the show, RT correspondent, Caleb Maupin. Hey, Caleb, how you doing? You're up in New York, correct?
I am. How are you doing?
Okay, good. So we want to talk about China with you, but first, you're up in New York, so how's it going up there for you?
Well, it's a little rainy. I'm looking out my window. I'm not seeing many people, but the sun is up. It's May 1st, but we won't be seeing any big left-wing demonstrations as, of course, public gatherings are not happening. But we're entering a new month here, and it's a little rainy outside, but not many people out on the street, and I'm sitting in my lovely apartment. I've been staying indoors as much as I possibly can. And we're just continuing to have a city on lockdown.
Caleb, I did want to ask you a question because I know you're a guy that can answer it. We were talking about Mayday a little bit earlier, and I did mention I do know that there is some connection of Mayday to a celebration of getting the 8-hour workday. Maybe you could give us a little. I'm sure I'm guessing you're going to be able to give us a little bit of history on Mayday on what that's about.
Sure. Well, it goes back to Chicago in the protests that were taking place in like the 1880s in Chicago for the 8-hour workday. And you had miners and others that were protesting. There was an incident at Haymarket Square in Chicago, and you had a number of anarchist leaders who were executed for the crime of allegedly throwing a bomb. They claimed it was a frame-up, and there was a whole struggle to free them. And it was actually the international, the Socialist International, or the International Working Men's Association or whatnot, that declared May 1st to be International Workers' Day. And leftists and socialist groups started celebrating it. And what's funny is that in the United States, we finally got around to having a Labor Day holiday in the 1930s. But part of the deal was it had to be in September. It could not be the International Workers' Day, May 1st. So we have Labor Day declared by the Roosevelt administration, but it's not on May 1st like it is in almost every other country in the world. You know, every other country in the world, May Day, May 1st is International Workers' Day or Labor Day. Here in the USA, it's in September. So it's kind of amusing because it started here. It started over the situation in Chicago.
Well, that's why when I said it's a big day for socialists and communists, that's accurate, right, Caleb?
Oh, of course. I mean, this is the big holiday. Now, what's interesting also is that some people will trace it back to the history of the European celebrations of the European pagans, the maypole and the whole history there. They'll say that perhaps there's some connection. That this is in Europe, people have been marching and celebrating May 1st with pagan traditions going back to the pre-Christian era in Europe. But ultimately, yes, it's due to the Chicago protests that happened for the 8-hour day, the Haymarket Square incident. That's how it was declared by the Socialist International to be May 1st, International Workers' Day. Way back, it's been many, many years this has been going on, and it wasn't just the hard left communists who did it, but social democrats honored it, and now in most European countries and in most countries in the world, it's just International Workers' Day.
Well, yeah, and you probably, I don't know if you've been out there, Caleb. There's this one cemetery in Chicago that's almost like there's so many people who were part of that early socialist movement in Chicago in this one cemetery that's out there. And the Haymarket Square, you talk about that. Haymarket, obviously, back in there's a statue about Haymarket Square, and I forget, I think it's been demolished, destroyed 3 times or something like that. You know what I'm talking about there with the Haymarket
right.
monument?
These leftist leaders were hanged for the crime of allegedly throwing a bomb that killed a police officer during a demonstration. There was a lot of evidence they didn't do it. And it took place in Haymarket Square. And so, in Haymarket Square, there is actually a statue to commemorate the police officer who was killed. And so, many leftists kind of see that as a spit in their face, kind of, celebrating this fact that these these leftist leaders were hanged for it, and I think the Weathermen blew it up in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yes, that's correct.
Demolishing that.
I did want to ask you this, I guess, since it is International Workers' Day and you're kind of an expert in this area. I have often heard it said that there was, I know before, kind of the, say the 1940s, 50s, there was a socialist, there was an actual American Communist Party, and they had a lot to do in labor. They had a lot to do as far as getting some of the work, getting rid of child labor and getting the 8-hour workday and things of that nature. And maybe you could, I guess it is Labor Day, maybe you could clear that up on that and on their involvement in that kinds of stuff.
Well, it's Mayday.
Yeah.
Labor Day is September, but yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's what I mean. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Caleb.
Well, yeah, I mean, the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, which merged into the AFL, now it's the AFL-CIO, but the CIO was largely built by the Communist Party. The AFL, which was the union that was more traditional, had a ban on what they called unskilled workers, it was only for craftsmen. But the CIO, they're the ones that organize the auto workers unions, they're the ones that organize the steel workers into unions. And they were famous for their, they didn't have a ban on Communist Party members being union organizers. And they conducted the sit-down strike wave of 1936 and 37, where workers occupied their factories, demanding the right to jobs. And that's why we had, that great American dream. They talk about those good-paying industrial jobs, well-paid steel workers, well-paid automakers. Well, that came from the fact that they were unionized by the Communist Party, largely. The Communist Party sent its cadre into the CIO, and they told workers to go and protest, occupy their factories. And you look at the struggle to the Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 37. They call it Labor's Gettysburg, basically. And that was a huge mobilization. These auto workers were going to lose their jobs, so they occupied their factory. And they sat down, and thousands of people came outside the plant to protect them, not just to protect them from the police, but also to protect them from the Black Legion, which was like a fascist Ku Klux Klan kind of organization that tried to drive them out of their factory. And then everyone remembers that epic moment where Roosevelt sent the military into Flint, and they assumed the military was going to drive the workers out of the factory. The military pulls up, and they point the machine gun away from the factory and protect the striking workers inside the factory. People saw that as a big moment. And then Roosevelt's administration starts telling workers they have the right to have a sit-down strike and occupy their factory and protest. And all across the country, workers occupied their factories. And you had the rise of the CIO. And that was the Communist Party USA that did that. I mean, that was William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and people like that were doing all kinds of militant stuff, fighting for the rights of workers in industries. Nowadays, we know about low-wage workers, whether they work in, fast food, and a lot of the essential workers who are still on the job now, they make pretty low wages. But it used to be that workers in the big factories and in the big industries made pretty low wages as well. The reason that the industrial workers in the United States and, the meatpacking houses of Chicago and Pittsburgh and places like that, the reason they have decent wages is because there was militant labor struggle back in the 1920s and 30s, organizing for the rights of those workers and, building strong fighting unions that guaranteed those workers protections on the job. People have it in their heads that industrial jobs are just somehow, they're just magically good-paying jobs. That's not the case. They weren't good-paying jobs. It used to be that a lot of the workers in the steel plants and other industries were paid very, very low wages. They were immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, from Italy. They were paid very low wages, treated very badly. The unions wouldn't organize them. The AFL said that they were unskilled and didn't want to touch them. But then, it was the Communist Party that built the CIO and had this kind of militant attitude, eventually got into an alliance with the Roosevelt administration and really created that industrial middle class that we associate with the American dream.
No, and some people would argue that the recent problems, for instance, Obamacare and other things, that the unions are really victims in a sense of their own success because people are so used to all the regulations that got in place by the early days of the union. The unions really, what they were fighting for became less and less. And what they started fighting for was not wage increases, but benefit increases in the recent decades. And then, of course, Obamacare came along, and some of the biggest people who were critical of it were actually the unions in some senses. When you talk about those Cadillac plans, those were the plans that the unions had negotiated instead of wage increases. And suddenly, a lot of that got wiped out. So a great history, Caleb. Appreciate it. Now, let's talk about those stinking Chinese commies, shall we? That's what Mike Pence is just that close to saying it. They're talking about, if you listen to, I was at CPAC, Caleb, and there was a lot of talk about communism and socialism. The whole theme of CPAC this year was fighting socialism. And I guess they thought Bernie might win or something, because Biden is not really a socialist. But I'm seeing the term Chi-Com get used on the right quite a bit now. And they always, whenever they refer to the Chinese, they talk about the Chinese communists. There's a Chinese communist media guy in the White House or whatever. And it is really part of a new Cold War. We only have a couple minutes left. What's your take on that? I mean, I'm not exaggerating this level of Chi-Com hysteria, am I?
Well, I'm sorry. I've been arguing, about these kind of political issues for many years. And I've noticed that, whenever you talk about China's huge economic successes, people say, oh, well, that's because they're capitalists. But now when we're, seeing a big demonization of China, suddenly they're communist again. Now, are they capitalists or are they communist? Well, it depends. It depends how the argument goes. If they're economically successful, it's because they're capitalists. If you don't like them, if you're criticizing them around human rights or whatever, well, then they're all just a bunch of hardline communists. They can't make up their mind. But this allegation that we're hearing from Trump, where he claims that the virus, originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, despite the fact that the National Director of Intelligence has said it is definitely not man-made or genetically modified, it's very scary. And Trump is insisting, he's pushing this idea that somehow the virus started in a Chinese lab, and he says, quote, I can't tell you that. When he's asked about why, he says how he knows this. He says, I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that. He's the president of the United States. He can determine, he has the ability to determine if he can tell us it or not. You have to wonder who's talking to Trump in the back room. Trump is.
And I hate to cut you off,
down.
Caleb. I hate to cut you off. We'll have to get you back on soon, but we're just about out of time. So certainly appreciate you coming on. And I would say, to me, the various arguments against China from the right are the equivalents of the Me Too movement on the left. They're just craven political tools, and whenever they're convenient, they become whatever they need them to be to attack whoever they need them to attack. All right, we'll be right back. You're listening to the most informative radio show in the Milky Way galaxy. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.